This week on FX Guide TV.
We head to Montreal to speak with Philippe Soeiro and get the scoop on the new Flame 2016 release.
Hello and welcome to FX Guide TV. This week, John Montgomery is in Canada to look at the new developments with high-end compositing and Autodesk's Flame.
Well, thanks for that, Angie. And yes, I'm up here in balmy Montreal for our annual visit, checking out the new release from Autodesk, chatting with Philippe Soeiro, who's the lead product designer. And I started by asking him about the 2016 release and the overall philosophy behind the workflow changes.
For us, it's definitely to bring closure to a number of things that we kind of left open in the 2015 release cycle. It was unfortunate for us that some things had to be left out of the scope of 2015. We did a lot of investments over the past 3 releases, I think, on introducing much better and much tighter timeline integration into the application with the reels, the flow graph, reinstalling a recursive BFX workflow. So lots of stuff had been happening over the course of the 2015 release cycle. This is much more about also bringing closure to more of the desktop component of the workflow. And that's been really, we said that is something that was very dear to us, but we believe that 2016 actually really brings closure on the overall workflow, definitely tying in a very unprecedented way, I would say, the way that Reels, flow graph, and the timeline can really work together in the context of batch, in the context of the desktop. So yes, the goal for us is to really reach a workflow plateau over which we're going to continue to build. And so it is a bit of a, I think it's still, a bit of an adjustment for users who have been following us on this workflow trek, I would say, in the wake of the anniversary release. But it's definitely the last one. I think I'm really happy to say at this point that we feel we've reached really closure on the overall core application workflow. And we think that it was very important actually to make that investment because it is really an essential part of what makes Flame a Flame. It is the way that you operate it, the way that you can very easily navigate from a view that exposes more than just one clip, more than just one thing in the player, more than just one flow graph. All of those things are, I think, very essential just to making an application more than just the sum of its parts. And ultimately, it's kind of the value that you can't necessarily, it's a harder to sell a thing to do, but it's an essential component of what actually makes Flame fast at the end of the day. So it was essential for us to make sure that we brought it to the level where we wanted it to be, and that's definitely the goal that we had with 2016.
Well, you mentioned fast, and one of the things that's fast about using the software is muscle memory. And over the last several releases, there have been a lot of workflow changes, kind of slows that down. In this release, while not as major as the anniversary release, there's still even more workflow changes. Would you say this is the end of those big changes moving forward?
In terms of button and button placing, I wouldn't be so sure because there are, I think, other areas of the application that still need some attention, and of course it means that as we modernize them, they also get affected by things in the UI. So button placement is still likely to change in some components. But I think what I mean to say is that the baseline workflow of the application, how you interact with the timeline, how you interact with the reels, how it relates to the flow graph, all of those things I think at this point have reached a plateau and are unlikely to change in the future. The structures that we support at this point, whether what we introduced in Extension 2, which we call the reel groups, and now the batch groups that have been complementing this in the context of 2016, those are structures that are here to stay and are not going to change in the future. We may make some adjustments based on the feedback that people will give us once they start using them, but overall the skeleton of the workflow is going to remain what it is in 2016. People have been requesting all sorts of modernizations across the application that we haven't necessarily got to, and that also means that some portions of the UI are still likely to change in the future, but that's part of a modernization, I guess, process more than anything.
We're going to take a look at some of those workflow changes in just a second, but now I want to switch to creative features in the software. Starting out with some significant architectural changes to the way that effects are applied to media layers within Action.
Yeah, I think this is part of an overall, as I said, plan that we've had to gradually work our way through critical components of the application. And we've reached the point where we're starting to focus on the very essential case of action. And in the context of 2016, indeed, there is an important thing that has happened, is that we've essentially solved, one of the complaints that people had in the past about using what we've called the indirect modules of action, the keyer and the color corrector through the media layers, that they tend to be slower than the rest of the batch process. And indeed, it's because it was still kind of a pipeline of its own that we hadn't had a chance to actually replace with the actual batch rendering pipeline. So in 2016, that's now something that's taken care of, which means that whether you choose to use the color corrector as a media effect in Action or as an external node in batch is not going to come at the cost of performance. It's going to be more a choice of what matters, what context matters. And if it's more relevant to do something in the context of Action, then there's not going to be a cost, a performance tax associated to it anymore. And the changes have been rippled through any instance of Action, so they also benefit desktop Action for those who still want to use Action as a separate module outside of the batch environment. All of the architectural work that we actually did for Action spreads across all of its instances, and now batch as a module in the desktop is behind the scene absolutely identical to batch as a node inside of Action. We just don't present it the same way to you, but same performance, same underlying architecture. So that's great. An interesting side effect also of doing that modification is that things that used to be kind of agglomerated, like the color corrector and the color warper, which were in this weird module that used to
or proposition.
Yeah, so that's gone. Effectively, they've been replaced by their batch counterparts, which means that they are now separate. So you can choose to have a color corrector and a color warper simultaneously, which is not possible. Also, things like the blur is now the blur node underneath the hood, so you have access to the actual full blur functionality of the batch node as an editable module through the media list. So there's some interesting advantages that come with that change.
Well, the reason I brought up the new media layer processing is because I think it's important to understand that and how it relates to two new features in Action, which are both Matchbox support as well as Lightbox. Let's talk first about how Matchbox was implemented in Action.
Yeah, so from the very beginning when we introduced Matchbox, we tested the waters, seeing whether the Flame user base was open to something that would involve some kind of custom development, and it turned out that yes, through the involvement of few key people. There's been actually a lot of uptake in using Matchbox to produce custom-based effects or bring functionality that we cannot bring to the application in a timely fashion. And we've gone from introducing it in batch to placing it also in the timeline, and now we're placing it inside of Action. It's the same Matchbox shader, but they don't necessarily provide exactly the same service to you. In batch, that's probably the most commonly used. It's a node. You bring it in a flow graph. In the timeline, it's almost a real-time process that you can actually just add on top of a timeline layer in an editorial context, which makes it very fast to do some adjustments. And in Action, even though it is the same shader, it is something that operates in the antechamber of the Action scene. It operates on any texture that Action is going to use. And when I say any texture, this can be, you know, whether it's a displacement, whether it's a normal, whether it's a diffuse texture, all of those things that eventually get applied onto a geometry that is then represented in the scene, Matchbox can actually affect. And it delivers a very non-linear method of applying effects to things that ultimately get represented in the action scene. In batch, you have to parent things, you know, you have to create literally a serialized flow graph. In action, we present Matchbox in the form of a node in the schematic that can get parented to multiple textures instantaneously and therefore affect them very quickly. We use the priority editor to deal with priorities of these effects between them. And that happens after the media pipeline. So all of a sudden you have, first of all, an extraordinary diversity of effects that can be applied to textures inside of action. You can also use it to extract information from textures, such as extract normals. And actually we have our own Matchbox that we're introducing here that does that directly in the context of the action scene. But again, the method of applying them is very different. And in some instances, I mean, even though you can think it's a bit more convoluted because it's applied to texture, there are things that you can do very quickly as a result of that because it's not tied, it's not bound by the serial mechanisms of the actual batch flow graph. It gets instanced, it gets daisy chained, much like any kind of action-like node in the schematic of action. So very flexible and very fast, very fast.
So taking things a step further is the new Lightbox that, while similar to Matchbox in some ways, actually brings a whole new level of shading possibilities, albeit to the entire 3D scene.
Lightbox is a very different beast. I mean, although technically speaking, it is still a shader, you know. But really, when we thought of Lightbox, and we have, you know, we had been kind of envisioning this for many years, and we thought, you know, it would be really cool to have like a kind of like a look development tool that would be aware of what happens in the actual action scene. And that would not make a discrimination between something that's a geometry or something that is you know, a textured image, for example. And so Lightbox is effectively something that is a combination of a light, a kind of color correction tool, and an adjustment layers in the Photoshop sense of the term. But because it's a kind of like a combination of these three concepts, it can do things that neither separately can do. And so it introduces the concept of actually literally projecting effects into the action scene and understanding and mitigating the effect of the shader with the position, the distance, the angle of incidence, kind of like a light does. But at the same time, instead of actually you know, shining light into the scene, actually shining an effect. And it inherits from an adjustment layer, it inherits the capacity to do things like blend modes. But it does so really in 3D space. So you can start casting something like a gamma correction into your action scene and decide that it should be combined to the scene through multiplication, okay? It also understands priority, just like in adjustment layers. And so we use also the priority editor to convey the fact that you can daisy chain these shaders together, but decide in which order they should be actually applied through each light. So, so it's definitely a departure from what you would know with, let's say, traditional look development. And we think that in a very similar way to you know, the reasons why we chose to introduce something like an action G-mask, the fact that you would deal with certain problems in the action scene allows you to deal with certain integration problems where they actually appear, as opposed to upstream in the media and trying to tackle those and then see what the consequences of those changes are downstream, which is a very kind of like serial type of flow graph type of workflow. And of course, they complement each other very well, right. Very well. So in essence, Lightbox is also, for the first time, us opening the floodgates to custom development directly inside of the action scene. So you can create your own effects. You can completely sample the entire action scene if you want to. Everything is actually available through the Lightbox API that we are providing.
I think one thing that Lightbox shows is the need for a new or improved renderer within Action. I mean, over the last several years, you've seen really big improvements in real-time rendering in game engines like Unreal, as well as GPU physically based renderers. Is a new renderer something that you think flame artists could look forward to in the future?
I certainly would hope so. I think that it is something that is instrumental, I think, to the future of Flame. We've always seen Flame really as an integrator, and I think that integrating things together in the context of an artistic process no longer necessarily means exactly the same thing as it did 20 years ago. I think the original title for Flame was, it's an image integrator. I think that if we look at the future, I don't think we should certainly not constrain ourselves just to image integration. I think the key thing is to make sure that Flame remains or has an environment that is capable of very effectively dealing with both 3D and 2D in the same environment to make artistic decisions. Artistic decisions for integration, for integrating these things together, okay, and making them play together nicely. And in that context, yes, I think that having high quality rendering techniques is something that is absolutely vital for the product. I can't make any promises, of course, you know the drill, John, but it's very fair to say that it's something that is being thoroughly investigated.
Okay, in the past you've talked a lot about the fast interactive performance in Action and how important that is to the Flame experience. Are you opposed to having a renderer that takes a lot longer than that interactive preview?
Well, today I think that's already the case. I mean, if you activate certain options, you know, the actual rendering is going to be a lot longer than the interactive preview render that you have as you're manipulating your action scene, for example, you know, without the motion blur and the anti-aliasing and stuff like that. So it's definitely not, certainly not close to the idea. I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is always, you know, what are you likely to do inside of Flame when you combine those things together? And I think the answer that comes to mind for me immediately is that you try to make it look good, and and make it work with the rest of the shots. And that does not necessarily mean always for it to be physically accurate. So I think that high quality is one thing, physical accuracy is another thing, and what matters in Flame is that you have very effective interactive ways of bending the rules so that you get the image that you want.
Well, one thing I've thought about a lot when people talk about having a physically based renderer within Action is kind of be careful what you wish for. I think a lot of Flame artists, clients, artists themselves want to have a lot of art direction over effects, and they're seeing things like shadows, and that's one thing that you're going to lose if you have a true physically based renderer. Physically plausible, maybe, but what do you think about that?
I think that, you know, and again, I don't mean to say that you know, a physically based renderer is out of the question inside of Action. I think it's very clear now that interactive, physically accurate renders are making long strides towards interactive rendering, okay, GPU-based rendering. So this is definitely not something that is being ignored. However, I do think, because of the very nature, again, of what you do inside of Flame, that if we were to support something like that, it would probably be for a restricted number of use cases. Because for the most part of the things that you do, even inside of Action, the chances are that you will not necessarily be, you know, rendering things with index of refractions and stuff like that. It doesn't really matter that much. Maybe it will in some very specific cases, but that's why I think that the primary rendering technology of Flame should allow you to hack your way through things, because that's what you do, you know, and And there are certainly limitations as to how much hacking you can do if you're bound by the laws of physics, okay? And so again, I'm certainly not excluding the fact that, you know, a physically accurate renderer could make its way inside of Action. I do think, however, that it would probably need to be a secondary rendering engine for Action that you would be ready to use with a certain number of constraints that come from physical accuracy. But that next to it, you would have something that would still be very high quality, but would allow as much hacking as you can, as you want, actually, for that matter, or as your customer wants, as your clients want.
Well, why don't we give people a break from looking at us and dive in and take a look at some of the new features in the software.
Sounds good. The first thing that I'd like us to do is take a look at the workflow changes. And so here I've built a desktop, and to understand the changes that are happening in the desktop, I'm going to switch to the desktop tab here. Just take a look at the structures that I have inside of my desktop. So I built a desktop that's called fxguide right now, okay? And right now it's comprised of two different types of structures that I've combined together. One is a Reels group, something that we introduced in the previous extension, extension 2 actually, of 2015. And effectively you can look at this as a, you know, for those who came from Smoke, as a replacement to the folders that we had in the edit desk, in the edit desk library. So it's a substructure comprised of multiple reels, and I've deliberately color-coded it here so that we recognize what is what. Normally all those things actually of a uniform color. They're gray, but it's up to your discretion to decide whether or not to color-code them. So typically if you have a timeline-centric workflow and you do conform, this is where you start. You start with a reel group, you assemble your conforms and bring them into a Reels group. We'll see that this is something that you can then combine with the newer structure that I'm going to talk about, which is the batch group. Now, in previous versions, prior to 2016, you know, you only had one active batch set up at a time, okay? And if you created a new one, it was actually completely overriding the one that was currently loaded into memory, okay? So there was effectively no persistency of batch. That's actually changing inside in version 2016. And so each one of these green entries, and again, it's me color coding them so that it's clear, each one of these green entries are actually batch setups that are presently loaded into my desktop. So I can have more than one if I want to. So it's the days of just having one setup loaded in the schematic, and if you overwrite that, it's gone if you haven't saved your desktop. Those days are gone, okay? So let's take a look at, so that structure here is what we call a batch group, okay? If I switch to my schematic, you will see that right now I have a batch group that is presently loaded, okay? And if I double click on this one, it's loading instantly the other, another setup that's associated to it. Double click on another one, it's, you know, shifting between the various schematics as you see, okay? Now, what's interesting is actually this is a structure that has more stuff to it than previously. And to illustrate this, I'm going to temporarily switch to the batch tab that actually focus strictly on the batch group that I'm currently selected, okay? So again, notice that when I double click, I'm essentially loading a setup. All of these are persistent, okay? If I save my desktop, they're all going to be saved with my desktop as part of it. So it's easy for me to kind of decompose something into various shots, each shot being in a batch group, for example. It's totally possible for me to use this structure to do that, okay? So switch back to this particular batch group here and switch to the batch tab. And now, so I'm just focusing really now on this currently loaded batch group. And let's take a look at it at its internal structure. You see that it has two further subdivisions, okay? And essentially, really what you have are two classification mechanisms. We have we're introducing for the first time what we call schematic reels and shelf reels. Schematic reels is a structure in which you will choose to organize the clips that are actively being used in your current batch setup. Shelf reels are clips that you want to associate to your batch, maybe use, but are not effectively being used in your schematic, and you don't want them to crowd your schematic for nothing. Renders actually can be a good example of something that you would want to store inside of a shelf reel. You don't necessarily want them to appear in your schematic. You want them to be associated to your setup, but you don't necessarily want them to appear in your schematic. All right, so let's take a look. So these are actually reels, and this is the thing that's very new in 2016. The batch group actually has a batch setup now effectively has its own reel structure to organize the media that it's currently using, okay? And if I select a clip here, like for example, you'll see that it's actually currently being stored in a schematic reel. And if I switch to my reels view, you will see, so spacebar F3 to switch to my reels view, you will see now that what happens is that I'm visualizing the reel structure that is associated to that batch setup. So here the color coding is actually respected. Those 3 clips here that you see are currently stored into 3 different schematic reels, okay? And I currently have 3 shelf reels, one for batch renders that I'm presently hiding, and 2 others to store some sky plates and some various elements that I'm not using yet in my schematic, okay? There's a true bidirectionality now that exists between what's in these reels and what's in my schematic. It's the same thing. So for example, if I select a clip and hit the hotkey Alt F, I'm going to be instantly switched to my schematic of the matching batch setup, okay, centered on the clip that I just selected in the reels. I can do the opposite thing. I can actually select a clip here in my schematic, and if I wonder where is it in my reels, in my schematic reel, hit the F key, and I'm turned instantly to my reels view, and it's actually showing me which clip it is in my reels. So I can have really a means to classify all the stuff that I have right now in my schematics, and right now it's a very simple setup, obviously, so I'm using far too many reels for what I'm doing. But imagine that if I had things like explosions, smoke elements, graphic elements, Photoshop imports, they could all be stored in separate reels for me to have access to them instantly. And so I really have like the reels classification, and I have that is concurrent to the way that I organize things in my schematic for my thought process.
So instead of organizational, you have this big pot or area with files in the listing of images that are being used in your schematic or clips that are being used in your schematic. This provides an organizational view. But it's not just organizational, because you can actually do operations now to this clip you have selected right in this reels view without having to copy it out of batch or back into batch.
Exactly, that's very true. So it's not, the reels are actually fully functional. So again, if I select this clip and again switch back to my reels, this is the selected clip, and let's say I want to do something that I can easily do in the reels, such as, you know, browsing through it and kind of elect which portion of the clip I'd like to potentially remove, okay? Well, what I can do here is essentially take this particular clip and drop it, and I've just trimmed it, and it's been immediately trimmed in the actual batch schematic. So at this point, this is it used to be like over 500 frames. It's now down to 326. It's performed a gestural edit on the clip that is physically being used inside of an action setup. So again, full bidirectional capabilities. This clip is the same as this one. There's no difference. Now we want to talk a little bit more about Matchbox and how it exists in this texture space, which is you know, halfway between the action scene and right after the media pipeline, okay? And so one thing that I'm going to show, like in this particular case here, we'd want to create, like, the point of what we're going to show is try to build a look that's more dramatic and nicer than what we have here. It's very flat, what we have right now, and so we'll relight the scene, add some corrections and stuff like that, but directly in the context of the action scene. Perhaps I'm going to start with showing that when you're in action and you make the node bin appear, you'll see that we now have a dedicated Matchbox section. I want to point out that we actually introduced quite a few new Matchboxes out there, and I'm just going to show you 2 of them, like right now.
One I want to touch on is the front and matte adjustment
Oh, that's a
within
good
Matchbox,
point.
which is much faster than the
You're
workaround
right.
of using a source node.
So I want to mention this particular Matchbox in passing, because for anyone who is actually accustomed to using source nodes just for the purpose of offsetting a mat and a front, this is much, much better and much, much faster. So from now on, do not use a source node to just offset a mat and a front. This is significantly faster. Much more efficient and very clean, a very clean result. But let's take a look at how in this particular case, what I'd want to do first is, in the context of my actual scene, do a little bit of pixel filling here on the edges of my key. So there is a subset of pixel spread that's actually available as a Matchbox. It's the parallax algorithm that is there, and so let's see how you actually apply it to an object. And it's relatively simple. Here you see I selected an image. What's going to happen is if I try and drag a Matchbox, as I told you, Matchbox can only be applied to a texture. So what it's going to do is automatically kind of extract the diffuse texture of the object that is associated to it. And it will connect the parallax spread Matchbox directly to it. If I double click on it, it's going to expose a relatively simple UI. This is a UI that is constructed just with the XML files. Okay, so there are some constraints as to what you can do, but you'll see that there are also some new icons that are available, widgets that are available to Matchbox in this new release. So here I have parallax spread. And I can, if we take a look at what's happening here on the edges, you will notice that it's already kicking in as I adjust the values. You see it's very interactive. See, I can just, here you go. You see the effect instantly actually being applied to the scene, and this is actually being done in the context of the scene directly. So, so again, something that's very, very fast. You don't actually need to set a context on action. Just connect it directly to the texture that you want to affect, and add the parallax spread, and off you go. In this context, one of the things that we'd like to do is relight this scene. So one thing that's very cool to do is to extract the normals, for example, of that image. And so we have a Matchbox that does that. We call it map extract. And so how would you use it on this particular image? Well, you would first go to the make sure that you add a normal map and have your media selected from which you want to extract the normals, and just go ahead and add a normal map. Double click, it's connected here. And now at that point, I can go to Matchbox and locate the map extraction. With the normal map selection, double click, and it actually adds the map extraction tool. As you see, it's already operating a normal extraction, but obviously this is a bit too intense. It doesn't exactly make his skin look better. So we want to make sure that we actually apply like a filter on the height to kind of smooth the normals here. And we're going to go for something like around this, and perhaps scale the normals also a little bit more. And you'll see that instantly, the minute that we start playing with the light in the scene, and we have a light here, it's already going to have a very different effect in the scene compared to with and without. If I had hide the map extraction, you see that it does make for a very big difference in what we get as a result. That's quite a big difference. You can have multiple Matchbox that are applied to the same diffuse, by the way, or to the same texture. Okay, they are automatically daisy chained together, and you can actually use. You'll notice that in the priority editor, there is now a Matchbox section that allow you to, per texture, to determine which order in which the Matchbox should actually be applied. You just use the priority editor as you would. And by the way, it's a revamped priority editor in case you haven't noticed. And we'll see also that there are other sections like lights that are now available here to deal with Lightbox priorities in a very similar way. Let's take a look at something that is kind of complementary, which is Lightbox. And Lightbox is something, so you see here I have my main key light here that is an active light. And Lightbox is a shader that effectively attaches to a light and will project its effect into the action scene. But because it is connected to a lighting framework, it is also going to respect, for example, the exclusive links that we have in the action scene. So if I take a look at my node bin, my action node bin, you will notice that there's also a Lightbox bin, and so I can directly drag something into my schematic and it will attach to the light. But there's also another way of adding a Matchbox or a Lightbox. You will find that there's a generic Matchbox node or a generic Lightbox node that is here. And if I just double click on it, it's instead of actually dragging the specific Lightbox that I selected from the node bin, it's going to take me to the browsing. And so there's a range of tools that are there that pertain to color in general that should not be overlooked. It goes beyond what is actually currently available in just our legacy color correction tools in Flame. In this particular case, I'm actually going to choose a color correct. Okay, let's go. And as you see, the Lightbox directly attaches to the light that was selected. And of course, as I said, I could have directly extracted color correct from the node bin. The difference is one takes me to the browser, the one immediately connects the shader to the light. At that point, this is, if I double click on this, you'll see a UI that is somewhat inspired by the color corrector. With some differences. We have some limitations as to what we do because it's an XML file that actually dictates what appears in the UI, and so it may be not as elegant as something that would be a custom tool that we develop.
At the same time, though, you points out the good time to mention that you see a new widget here, which is the color wheel, which is also available within Matchbox in this release.
All the widgets, such as the curves, the color curves, the RGB curves, all of those things are actually the color wheel. All of these are actually available for both Matchbox and Lightbox. So it's a cool extension to create new types of tools with these widgets as well. And now I'm going to add to this a projected gamma correction. So I'm going to create something that's fairly dramatic. Goes something like this. This is already a lot more moody. And since my background substance texture is yellowish, I'm going to go for something also that goes in that same direction. So something that would be in the yellows like this and something like that. All right, and so at this point, the light is effectively casting color correction, and the effect of the color correction is actually being mitigated by the normals. They also respect the lighting framework, which means that if I sever the link that I have here, the lighting link here, automatically the color correction that is somewhat drastic gets also applied on the background image. I don't want that at this point. I only want this to affect my foreground character talent. And so I'm just going to maintain the exclusive link. But I wanted to make sure that people understood that the exact same habits that you develop with lights are actually applicable to Lightbox shaders as well. And so Lightbox, contrary to Matchbox, is really operating on objects that are in the scene. Matchbox is happening really in the antechamber of the scene. It's being applied to the texture. Lightbox is really, through the lighting system, effectively casting onto actual objects in the scene. So that's, in a nutshell, I think what I wanted to present to you at a very high level for the look development stuff that we introduced in 2016.
Well, we always appreciate Philippe taking the time to chat with us here in Montreal and get the scoop and the details behind the software. Just want to take a moment to mention we have a fantastic new Flame course running this term at fxphd.com, being taught by Joel Osis. We've got a lot of other Flame courses and great new classes covering things like VR, Nuke, and more. Check those out at fxphd.com. Well, that's it for me from Montreal. Let's head on back to the studio in Edgy.
You know, FX Guide started in the late 90s as a tips and tricks site for flame artists, with little more than a portable hard drive and a crappy net connection in Chicago. 16 years later, and FX Guide is still free and working to help compositors and artists be the best they can be. We are helped in doing that by you, and especially our FX Guide Insider members, who contribute each year. Now, if you'd like to be a part of FX Guide, then click on the FX Insider link on the homepage. Thank you so much, and until next time, see ya. For more industry news, in-depth features, podcasts and forums, check out fxguide.com. And for visual effects training, check out fxphd.com.